Ever had someone you love look you in the eye and erase you with one sentence? Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a partner. Maybe it was the whole family deciding you didn't belong, not loud but quietly in front of everyone. I spent years twisting myself into someone they'd finally approve of. Swallowing my words, shrinking my dreams, smiling at the table even when my heart was begging me to leave. Until the night my father told me in front of 100 people that I was no longer his. You want to know what I did next? I stopped asking for a seat, and I walked out with the only person who ever truly saw me. Have you ever realized your real family wasn't the one you were born into, but the one who stood up when no one else would? Drop your story in the comments. This one is for you. And it's also for me. Because before I knew what real family felt like, I stood alone in rooms where people clapped for my last name, but couldn't look me in the eye. That night in Seattle, I learned what it meant to be erased. Not by strangers, but by the people who once taught me how to speak. That night began here, Seattle. Spring. Rooftop flickering with rain and city light. I watch my reflection blur in the glass. Everyone is here, everyone but me, really. Tonight I am invisible. Background noise in my own life. Inside, my father glows with pride. Harold Archer, legend, architect, king of the room. He raises his glass. He doesn't see me, he sees legacy. He sees Lucas, perfect son. Serena, flawless daughter. Everything he can name with pride. I wonder just for a second what it would feel like to be loved out loud. My husband Eliot squeezes my hand under the table. His thumb moves in slow, steady circles. It's the only warmth I trust. Dad's speech comes sharp. Each word chosen like a blade. We celebrate those who carry the Archer name with pride. He looks at Lucas. He looks at Serena. And when his eyes reach my side of the table, they simply move on. I sip my wine. It tastes like rainwater and regret. He keeps talking. Jokes about legacy. Jokes about winning. And then the silence drops. He turns. Eyes like winter. Vivian, I think you should leave. Tonight is for family. No anger. Just a sentence flat as glass. Someone's fork clatters. Someone laughs too loud to fill the air. I don't move at first. I feel my hands in my lap steady cold. My brother looks away. My sister doesn't. Eliot stands. He stands for me. That's the part I'll remember. Not the cruelty, but the quiet choice to not let me leave alone. I stand too. No apology, no scene. I walk. He walks with me. Seattle's rain soaks my skin. The night air stings, but it's real. He opens the car door. His eyes ask if I'm okay. I breathe in slow. The city blurs behind glass. Something in me uncoils. I spent my whole life begging for a place at that table. Tonight I chose my own exit. And maybe, just maybe, that's where all real stories begin. Would you fight to stay, or would you walk away with your head held high? Tell me. I'm listening. I didn't look back. Not when the elevator closed, not when the room fell away behind glass and chandeliers. Not even when the valet asked too politely if everything was all right. I walked because staying would have meant silence, and I'd had enough of swallowing my voice. My heels clicked against marble like punctuation. Each step a line break. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the scene they were hoping for. Outside, Seattle pressed in. The air was damp and sharp, like truth. Eliot was beside me. He didn't speak, he didn't have to. The car door opened with a quiet click. I slid inside, my fingers still curled around nothing. My body rigid. My mind softer than expected. The city blurred behind rain-streaked windows. I counted traffic lights instead of memories. Eliot drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near mine on the console, not touching but close. Steady. Say it, I whispered finally. Say it was awful. He didn't. He just said you didn't flinch. And I hadn't. That surprised me more than anything. I'd always imagined that kind of moment, being erased in front of people who shared my blood, would destroy me. It didn't. It emptied something out. But it didn't break anything I still needed. We pulled into our street. Our apartment was dark, the bookstore beneath it glowing faintly. Closed but not asleep, I stood at the curb a second longer than I needed to. Let the rain kiss my shoulders. Let the quiet settle. I think I'm still in shock, I said. Eliot looked at me like I'd just spoken truth for the first time all night. You don't have to make sense of it, he said. Just feel it, that's enough. Inside, I left the heels by the door. The makeup stayed on. So did the silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting in my lap. Same way they had at that table. Same stillness. Only this time I wasn't waiting for someone to see me. He brought me tea. Didn't ask if I wanted it. Just set it down gently and sat across from me, elbows on knees, eyes soft. I thought I was prepared, I said. For rejection. For the usual snub. That wasn't usual, Eliot replied. I nodded. I know. And I did. Because this time he didn't just skip my name, he stripped my belonging. And the room clapped. That was the worst part, not the sentence. But the fact that no one stopped him from saying it. I exhaled. Slow, measured. Dry. I remembered being 12 school awards night. I got second place in the art contest. He leaned down during dinner and said, if it's not first, don't bother putting it on the fridge. That was the year I stopped drawing. I'm tired, I said quietly. But not the kind sleep fixes. Eliot nodded. Do you want to talk to him? No, I said. No more proving. No more asking. A pause. I think I'm done trying to be the kind of daughter he can be proud of in front of his friends. And just like that, something inside me settled. Not healed, not yet. But stable. I brushed off my dress, picked up my tea, and for the first time in years, I didn't replay the night in my head searching for where I went wrong. Because maybe for once I hadn't. Some exits don't require slamming the door. Sometimes the most powerful thing you do is leave without letting it shatter you. Have you ever walked away from the place you thought was home and realized the peace wasn't in staying, but in finally choosing to go? Tell me. You're not the only one. There's a list I've kept in my head since I was 8. I never wrote it down. But I could recite it backward if I had to. Things Vivian does wrong. Too quiet. Too emotional. Too artsy. Too soft. Too stubborn when it doesn't matter and too passive when it does. That last one was a favorite. My father once said it after I didn't interrupt Serena's presentation even though I had a better solution. He leaned down at dinner that night cutting his steak with surgical precision and said, if you're not going to fight for your ideas, don't have any. That was at 16. I remember it more clearly than my graduation day. The day after the party, I stayed in bed longer than usual. Not hiding, just still. The kind of stillness you sit inside when your mind finally gives you a few inches of silence. But silence doesn't mean peace. It means memory has room to move. I walked to the kitchen barefoot, the wood floor cool against my skin. Eliot had left a note, went to pick up coffee. You were still breathing quietly. I didn't want to break it. There was a croissant on the counter. No crumbs. Wrapped like a gift. I didn't touch it. I opened my notebook instead. Not the one for work. The other one. The one that holds the pieces I don't say out loud. I didn't know what I was writing until I saw the words, reasons I'm not enough. Not a question. A title. My hand moved before I could stop it. I wrote. Didn't go into architecture like Dad. Didn't marry a lawyer like Serena. Didn't have kids by 35 like everyone else. Published books. No one in the family reads. Still cries at movies. Still asks permission to feel. The pen stopped. I stared at the page. And for the first time I felt angry. Not sad, not ashamed, just furious. Because none of those things were faults. But somehow they had become my religion. I remembered the last family meeting. Lucas presented a new investment plan. Serena talked about a conference in Switzerland. When it was my turn, I said I'd launched a literacy program with 3 underfunded schools in Tacoma. My father nodded once and said, "How are book donations going? Any real numbers?" That was it. 3 months of planning grant applications, teacher meetings, collapsed under the weight of real numbers. I closed the notebook, walked to the mirror, tied my hair back, looked at my own face like it belonged to someone I didn't owe anything to. I said out loud, "I am not your failure." It didn't echo, but it landed somewhere deep. That afternoon, I walked to the bookstore. Rain again. Always rain. But it felt softer now, like it knew what I needed. The store was quiet, muggy in that comforting paper-scented way. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, turned on the lights one by one. Each click felt like reclaiming. I walked the shelves. Fiction, memoir, poetry. Yeah. Women who'd written through fire. Men who told the truth even if no one applauded. Spines that had been bent but never broken. Books don't beg for legacy. They exist. And that's enough. I made coffee in the back room. The old machine hissed just like it always does. On the bulletin board was a flyer for our next author reading. Her name was Sarai. She'd written about surviving emotional abuse from her adoptive family. I remembered the day she cried in the corner of the shop after reading her own chapter aloud for the first time. She looked at me like I was safe. And I realized this place, this life, it was legacy. Just not the kind anyone at that rooftop would clap for. Later that evening, Eliot found me sitting behind the counter. No makeup. Notebook still open beside me. One page written, and then another page torn out and thrown away. He didn't say anything at first. Then he said, "You look like yourself." I didn't answer, but I reached for his hand. Held it like it was the first thing on the list that made sense. The list of faults they gave me, I used to wear it like scripture. Now I'm writing a new list, not for them, for me. Have you ever mistaken someone else's expectations for your own reflection? What did it take for you to finally stop seeing yourself through their eyes? Tell me. I'm still learning how. There was no explosion. No angry call. No dramatic confrontation. Just silence. A slow spreading quiet that seeped in through every corner of my life. The kind that doesn't echo. It just absorbs. The next morning, the family group chat lit up. Lucas' dad did what he thought was best. "Let's not make it bigger than it is. Serena." He was under a lot of pressure. "Maybe don't take it so personally." No one mentioned my name, they just talked around it. Like I'd become an empty chair at the table. Like I was already gone. Aunt Jo sent a string of rose emojis. Her version of support. Or avoidance. Hard to tell. Someone posted a photo from the night before. Dad, Lucas, Serena, and a cake that cost more than my rent. The caption read, "Celebrating Legacy." I closed the app. But it stayed in my chest. That feeling, not of being hated, but of being unmissed. It's heavier than anger. Heavier than shame. It's erasure. Not dramatic, not bloody. Just final. At the bookstore, I tried to shelve new arrivals. But my hands kept shaking. Spines blurred. Titles didn't register. I stared at the section labeled Family and Relationships. Wanted to rip the sign down. At 3:42 p.m. a text buzzed in. Unknown number. Sometimes it's better to just keep peace. No name, no signature, but I knew the tone. Dad never sent threats. Just consensus. People did his work for him. A few hours later, a college friend messaged me. She'd seen a comment thread on Facebook. Some old family acquaintance had posted. Maybe she just couldn't handle the truth. 12 likes. 3 nodding emoji. 0 defense. I didn't respond to any of them, but I felt the weight of every unsent reply. I wanted to scream. I didn't break that night. I was broken long before it. And I still showed up. In heels, with a gift, with hope. Hope that was my mistake. I sat on the floor of the bookstore that night, back against the poetry shelf. Eliot found me there. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just handed me a cup of hot ginger tea. The kind I drink when I can't breathe right. He sat next to me, knees touching mine. Didn't say a word for 22 minutes. He timed it once. Said that's how long it usually takes for my body to stop thinking it's still under attack. I asked him finally, am I crazy for still wanting to be understood by them? He shook his head. You're human. Then he looked at me. But maybe you're asking understanding from people who are allergic to truth. That landed hard, because I realized the truth isn't what gets you cut off. It's asking people to acknowledge it that makes you dangerous. The Archer family didn't reject me because I failed. They rejected me because I kept showing up whole when they needed me to stay small. And now that I'd left the room, they were making sure no one followed. Later that night, I opened my inbox. Among the spam and auto-promotions, there was one message. From Sarai, the author who read here last month. Her subject line just said, "That took courage." Inside, she'd written, "I watched the clip. You didn't blink." That was the moment I knew I could finally tell my mother the truth. I stared at the screen for a long time. One email. From one woman. But it weighed more than the silence of 30 relatives combined. So I hit reply. Thank you. You have no idea what that meant. But I think she did. Because sometimes the loudest thing is not who claps when you're celebrated. It's who whispers, "I saw what they did." And I stayed anyway. The weight of silence isn't in what no one says. It's in knowing you were never meant to be heard there to begin with. Have you ever been erased, not with cruelty, but with quiet compliance? And what helped you find your voice again? Tell me. You're not alone in that silence anymore. He didn't call. Of course he didn't. He sent Serena an email. Dad wants to speak with you, just the two of you. Think it through. No apology. No subject line. Just instructions. As if that night hadn't happened. As if I should feel lucky to be summoned. I stared at the message for 5 full minutes. Not reading. Just watching the screen. Eliot said, "You don't have to go," and I knew that was true, but I also knew I was ready. Not for a fight, but for a conversation I'd never allowed myself to finish. So I replied, "I'm available Thursday. 10 a.m. At the bookstore." Your move. He came. Sharp suit. Expensive silence. The same smell, wood polish, aftershave control. He didn't shake my hand, didn't ask how I'd been. Just looked around and said, "So this is what you do now." I motioned to the seat across from me. No smile. No small talk. Just space. He sat. Took off his gloves like it was a courtroom. Laced his fingers together. Then said, "That display at the party was unnecessary." I blinked once. "That's what you're here to talk about." "I'm here to talk about the fallout," he said. "Fallout," I repeated. "From you telling your daughter to leave in front of your colleagues." He ignored that. "You've embarrassed the family. We're still repairing reputational damage." I leaned back. There it was. Not love. Not regret. Image. Always image. I said nothing. He hated that. "Vivian, I raised you to be composed. This performance of yours online at that bookstore, it's beneath what our name represents." "Our name?" I tilted my head. "You mean the one you stripped from me in front of 70 people? He shifted. "Not much. Just enough to register." "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not." I folded my hands calmly. "For once, I'm being precise." He exhaled through his nose. "Taught me that technique when I was 10, when real anger was considered unsightly." "You've made things difficult." "There's talk of restructuring the family trust." There it was. The threat. Not even subtle. I nodded slowly. "Let me save you the paperwork. You can take me off everything." He blinked. "I don't want your money, Dad." Pause. What I wanted was to be seen. He said nothing. I let the silence stretch. Let him feel what it's like when someone doesn't rush to fill his discomfort. Then I stood up. Walked to the counter. Pulled open the drawer where I kept old things I didn't wear. Took out the chain he gave me at 17, the one with the Archer family crest. Set it on the table between us. I won't wear a name that comes with conditions. He didn't touch it, didn't even look. Just said, "You've always been overly sensitive." I smiled. And this time it wasn't tight. I used to think that was a flaw. Now I think it's the only reason I survived you. He stood. Is that all, number? I looked him in the eye. Unblinking. I forgive you. He frowned, but not because you asked. Because I won't carry this anymore. He turned to leave. Before he reached the door, I added, "You should try it sometime." Letting go of the performance. He didn't respond. Didn't turn back. Just walked out. I stood in the middle of the bookstore, still holding the velvet pouch I'd wrapped the chain in. Felt the weight of it in my palm. It was lighter than I remembered. Sometimes confrontation isn't fire, it's air, a clearing, a vacuum of control. Where you finally realize you don't have to win the fight, just refuse to play the game. Have you ever stood across from someone who wants to find your worth and realized they had no power unless you handed it to them? Tell me. Because that morning I took it back. He left the door open when he walked out. Typical. Always assuming someone else would close things behind him. I didn't move for a while. Just stood there staring at the empty chair and the chain I'd laid on the table. It looked like inheritance. But it felt like weight. I picked it up. Dropped it in the donation bin next to the counter. Didn't wrap it. Didn't hesitate. Let someone else decide what to do with it. That was the shift. Not a breakdown. Not a declaration. Just a quiet decision. This was mine now. My space, my time, my permission. I spent the afternoon rearranging the front windows. Nothing drastic, just reclaiming the corners. Took down the quote from Maya Angelou. Replaced it with one from Toni Morrison. "You are your best thing." It wasn't for customers. It was for me. I dusted shelves I hadn't touched in months, wiped fingerprints off glass, tossed 3 display signs that no longer meant anything. In the back office, I opened old folders. Contracts. Invoices. Names I'd said yes to out of fear I'd be seen as difficult. I recycled half of them. Kept the ones that still made my stomach settle. Sometimes healing isn't poetic. Sometimes it looks like trash bags and open windows and playlists with no lyrics. Eliot came home to the smell of lemon oil and the sound of nothing. He paused at the door, took in the change display. Tilted his head. "New phase?" he asked. I nodded. No announcement, just motion. He smiled. "Sounds about right." We ate dinner on the floor. Left the table for once. Steamed dumplings from the place down the block. Warm. Soft. Messy in the best way. I told him about the meeting. He didn't flinch when I said I gave the necklace away. Didn't say good for you. Didn't need to. He reached for my hand instead. That's the thing about real safety, it doesn't come with commentary. Just presence. That night I wrote 2 things in my notebook. 1, I don't need their version of peace. And 2, silence can be sacred, not just strategic. I slept without medicine for the first time in weeks. Not because I wasn't anxious, but because I'd finally stopped apologizing to myself for how tired I was. The next morning, I declined an invitation. Serena had sent it. Her wedding. No subject line again. Just would be good to see you. Low drama, please. Low drama, like my existence was the chaos. I didn't reply. But I did delete the calendar hold. In the bookstore's inbox, a new message popped in. Sarai again. She'd been nominated for a local award. She wrote, "If I win, you're the first person I'll thank." I didn't cry, but I did pause. That used to be all I wanted, acknowledgement. Now I realized it only matters when it comes from someone who sees the cost behind the work. That week I added a new shelf. Small near the register. A sign above it read, "Stories that changed the writer." Nothing flashy, no explanation. But it caught people's eyes. One woman asked what it meant. I said, "Sometimes the hardest thing to write is the truth." She nodded, bought 3 books, and left a sticky note on the counter that read, "Yours is one of them." I kept that note, pinned it under the register. Legacy doesn't need lineage, it just needs clarity. Have you ever stopped trying to fix what hurt you and started building what heals you instead? That's the shift. And it's quieter than you think. The first time someone said, "You helped me survive," I almost didn't believe them. It was a Tuesday. Light rain, the kind Seattle does without meaning to. I was restocking the memoir shelf when a woman I didn't recognize stepped inside. She walked slow. Not browsing, searching, eyes tired in a familiar way. I nodded a greeting. She didn't speak. 10 minutes later, she brought 1 book to the counter. Sarai's. She held it like something sacred or dangerous. I rang it up in silence. Bagged it. Then paused. "You okay?" I asked softly. She swallowed. Then said, "I saw your post about her reading here. I came because of that." I nodded. "She's powerful." The woman looked down, then looked up again. "I'm not ready to tell my story, but I needed to be near a place where it would be safe when I am." I didn't say anything. Just placed both hands on the counter so she could see they weren't shaking. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a single folded napkin. On it a note written in red ink, "Your bookstore made me feel like I'm not the crazy one." She slid it across the counter, didn't wait for a reply. Just walked out into the gray with her book and her breath. I stood there, napkin in hand, fighting back the kind of emotion that doesn't cry, it expands. Later that week, Sarai came in. She hugged me longer than usual, then handed me a copy of her next manuscript. On the first page she'd written for V. "Because you taught me we get to rewrite our endings." I closed the book, held it against my chest. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. That was new. Eliot and I hosted dinner that Friday. Just 4 people. 2 authors. 1 therapist. And a florist who always writes poems on the back of receipts. No one talked about family, not blood family anyway. We talked about movies and the ethics of spoiler warnings and the smell of old paper. Someone brought homemade bread. Someone brought a playlist. I brought space. At one point someone said, "It feels different here." I asked what they meant. She paused. "Like nothing here is pretending to be fine." I smiled. That was the goal. After everyone left, Eliot stood in the doorway watching me rinse wine glasses in the sink. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. Not because everything's better, just because I've stopped asking it to be. He walked over, kissed my temple. No commentary. Just warm. That night I lay in bed and reread Sarai's dedication. I remembered all the years I waited for someone in my family to say something half that kind. Then I realized I'd finally stopped waiting. In the morning, I got a message from Lucas. Just 2 words, "Coffee soon." I stared at it for a while. Then typed, "If we leave the past at the door." He wrote back, "We can try." It wasn't healing. Not yet, but it was something else. Something almost braver. Willingness. I met him 2 days later. No confrontation, no speeches. Just 2 people trying to talk about books and movies and where to find the best soup dumplings in Seattle. He didn't apologize. But he asked questions. Real ones. And when I left he said, "You're not what they said you were." I looked him in the eye. I never was. Some bridges don't need to be burned, they just need to be crossed carefully without carrying the fire from the last place you stood. Have you ever found connection in the most unexpected place, not because it was familiar, but because it was finally true? Tell me. Sometimes the other side isn't far. It's just quieter. The envelope came on a Thursday. Not a message. Not a call. A thick, cream-colored envelope hand-delivered. Unmarked. Just my first name written in ink I recognized. Precise. Impersonal. Like a place card at a table I no longer sat at. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the counter. Next to Eliot's mug, next to the grocery list, next to the life I actually lived. Eventually, I peeled it open. Harold Archer's 70th birthday gala. Formal, black tie. Rooftop museum downtown. The kind of venue booked 6 months in advance because Image always plans ahead. Clipped to the top was a handwritten note. Would be good to see you. Let's put the past behind us. H, not dad, not love. Just H. Like he was signing a contract. I reread it twice. Eliot didn't say anything. Just watched me from the kitchen, hands wrapped around his mug. Waiting for me to breathe first. I did. I don't know what this is supposed to mean, I said. You don't have to know, Eliot replied soft. You just have to ask yourself one thing. Would going back there cost you anything you're not willing to pay? I nodded. But I didn't answer him. Because the truth was, this wasn't about cost anymore. It was about definition. For the first time in my life, I wasn't angry. I wasn't begging. I wasn't trying to fix what broke years ago. I was just ready. Ready to see if I was still the girl who twisted herself into their shape, or finally the woman who stood in her own. And sometimes the only way to know for sure is to walk into the room and listen to who you become. I didn't reply. Not right away. I let the invitation sit overnight, between Bill's and Eliot's new crossword book. It felt less like a gesture, and more like a dare. The next morning I didn't wake up different, just quieter. Like something inside had been decided before I caught up to it. I stood in front of my closet. Opened the section I used to call them clothes. Blouses I wore to family brunches. Dresses I wore to charity events I didn't believe in, and one black silk gown. The one I wore to the last Archer Foundation gala, back when I was still their writer daughter. Silent enough to include. Smart enough not to threaten. It still fit. Of course it did. But it didn't belong to me anymore. I let it hang, let the air settle around it. Then I turned. Reached into the drawer that held pieces I bought without consulting anyone. And I found it, the midnight blue jumpsuit. Sleek, strong. No lace, no apology. It wasn't made for approval, it was made for movement. I hung it by the window. Let the light touch it like proof. Then I moved through the rest of the day without ceremony. I brewed coffee, fed the cat, sorted shipments for the store. No dramatic music, no power walk, just a woman choosing not to flinch. Around noon, Eliot came in from the shop with a to-go bag. Lunch from Mateo's, he said. I smiled. He set it down, then looked at the jumpsuit still hanging. You chose, he said. I nodded. I did. Not for them, I looked him in the eye. Number. This time it's for me to see if I still twitch when the room turns cold. He didn't ask anything else, he just sat with me while I ate. And later that night, when I zipped the jumpsuit up in the mirror, I didn't feel like armor, I felt like skin. The museum was lit like it was begging for cameras. Spotlights. Live jazz echoing against marble walls. Servers in black with silent shoes. My heels clicked against the entry like punctuation. No hesitation. No rush. Eliot had offered to come. I said no. Some doors. You walk through alone. Inside, everything shimmered. Gold uplighting. Crystal glassware. Laughter that sounded just a little too practiced. And then I saw them. My father, Lucas. Serena. Clustered near the stage. Their postures matching like choreography. Effortless. Or, so it looked. He saw me. His smile was instant, reflexive, a switch he'd never lost. Vivian, he called loud enough for surrounding ears. I'm glad you came. I walked closer, not fast. I'm not staying long, I said. Flat. Clear. Unbendable. His smile twitched, but didn't drop. Serena leaned in for a quick, careful hug. You look good. I didn't return the gesture. You too. Lucas gave a nod. No more. I didn't need more. Harold gestured toward the room. Tonight's about connection, he said. I looked him in the face. Connection doesn't start with erasure. For the first time, his mouth didn't know what to do. I held the silence. Didn't rush him out of it. Then I turned. Walked past the champagne tray, past the polite nods. Past the curiosity behind thin flutes and colder smiles. Found a seat by the window. Alone. And from there I watched the night happen. No one asked me to dance. No one invited me into a photo, no one forced me to pretend, and I didn't need any of it. Because for the first time in that room, I wasn't watching the door for a reason to leave. I was watching myself stay. On my own terms. Excuse me. I turned. A woman stood beside my chair. Silver hair sideswept. A deep navy dress that didn't try too hard. Eyes soft but steady. I didn't mean to interrupt, she said. I shook my head. You didn't. She paused. Then I wanted to thank you. I blinked. She gestured gently with one hand. Your bookstore. My daughter. She found it last spring. Came home one night with a small paper bag and a different kind of silence. The kind that isn't numb but full. She never told you, I'm sure, the woman said, but that place. Something about the shelf by the window. She said it was the first space she didn't feel like she had to shrink to fit. My throat tightened. I opened my mouth. No words came out. She smiled understanding. She's better now. Still healing. But she's laughing again. I stood slowly. Met her halfway in height. Thank you, I whispered. And meant it with my whole chest. The woman reached into her clutch, pulled out a folded slip of paper. From her. She said, if I saw you, to pass this along. I took it. Hands trembling a little. The paper was soft. Worn at the edges. Scrawled in slanted ink, I thought I was invisible. But then I walked into your store, and someone had already made space for me. No signature, no name. Didn't need one. I held the paper tight in my palm. Not to protect it, but to feel something real. Behind me, music swelled. Laughter rose. But I wasn't in that room anymore. I was in a place with soft lights, shelves that didn't judge, and people who arrived not to impress but to breathe. The woman touched my shoulder once. She made me promise not to thank you too loudly, she said, smiling. I smiled back. Good instinct. She disappeared into the crowd like a secret. But she'd already left the only mark that mattered. I sat back down. Unfolded the note again. Read it twice, not because I forgot, but because it reminded me some legacies don't come with last names. They come with quiet rooms. And shelves. And spaces that hold what the world tries to erase. I left without saying goodbye. No dramatic turn. No pause at the exit. Just one quiet breath and a coat over my shoulders. The night air outside hit cooler than expected. Spring in Seattle always does that, a reminder that even when things bloom, the chill doesn't leave right away. But I didn't shiver. I walked. Past the valet. Ignored the cluster of guests sneaking outside for air or gossip. Each step felt clean. Like I was peeling something off, not anger, not sadness, but the need to be read correctly. I didn't need them to know who I'd become. I just needed to live it. Eliot waited in the car 2 blocks away. Reading. He didn't text. Didn't check in. He trusted I'd leave when I was ready. When I opened the door, he looked up. You okay? I nodded. Fastened my seatbelt. I was more than okay in there, I said. I was untouched. He smiled, turned the key. As the engine hummed to life, I unfolded the note again. The one from the girl who found her breath in my bookstore. I held it to my chest. Not for comfort, for proof. I'd gone back. I'd looked them in the face. And I didn't shrink. I didn't rise to meet them either. I stayed exactly where I was and let that be enough. Back home, I lit a candle. Poured tea. Washed off the makeup I barely needed. Then I took the black gown from the back of the closet, the one that still fit but no longer belonged. Folded it. Dropped it into the donation bag. It didn't need to haunt me anymore. Legacy, I've learned, doesn't come from the rooms that forget you. It comes from the rooms you build where no one has to prove they're worthy to sit. And that was the choice. Not walking in, but walking out whole. Some endings don't crash. They breathe, they stretch, they release. Have you ever stepped out of the story others wrote for you and realized the quiet after isn't empty but yours? That's what freedom sounds like. Now tell me, when did you first stop apologizing for leaving the room? No one tells you how quiet it is after closure. Not the dramatic kind, not the shouting match, the real kind. Where no one begs. No one breaks dishes. You just stop waiting. Weeks passed. The city kept going. So did I. But different now. I stopped checking my email for family events. Stopped flinching at unknown numbers. Stopped rehearsing what I'd say if I ever saw them again. I didn't need the final word. Because I'd already said it to myself. I'm done. Not with malice. Not with ice. Just done with the cycle of offering myself up, hoping this time they'd choose differently. They didn't. I did. I chose space. And then I filled it. The bookstore changed. Not radically. Just honestly. I added a shelf by the door. It wasn't labeled new arrivals. It said books that brought us back to ourselves. I let customers write anonymous notes and slip them inside the covers. Some wrote about grief. Some wrote about joy. One wrote, I thought I needed to be brave. Turns out I just needed to be believed. We started hosting story circles once a month. No mics, no recordings, just a room. Chairs. Tea. A timer gently ticking. One rule, tell the truth, but only if you're ready. You'd be surprised how many people show up just to listen. Just to be in a room where no one's proving anything. That's the real power of a table, not who sits at the head but who feels safe enough to speak. Sarai came by more often. Her second book hit shelves quietly but spread like fire under the right hands. She said she'd never forgotten how I stalked her first when no one else would. People say you gave me a platform, she told me one day, but what you really gave me was the permission to believe I wasn't too much. I wrote that down. Posted it on the back wall. No quote marks. It didn't need attribution. It belonged to all of us. Eliot started hosting Sunday chess in the back room. It wasn't advertised, it just happened. Sometimes I'd walk in and see a retired lawyer playing against a teenage poet, no scoreboard. Just presence. One Sunday I brought in soup, set it in the middle of the room, community table I said. And someone, a man who never spoke more than 10 words, looked up and asked, "Is there room for me?" I didn't answer with words. I just pulled out a chair. That became the rhythm. No fanfare, no flyer. Just a table that kept getting longer because we refused to pretend healing required exclusivity. We built something without the blueprints of tradition. And it held. One night Sarai asked, would you ever invite them back? Your family. I stirred my tea. Watched the leaves spin. No, I said. But I would welcome anyone willing to enter without script. She nodded. That's the difference. Some people enter rooms to perform, others to witness. I no longer build space for the first kind. Lucas sent a letter. Not an apology, not a rope, just words. I get it now. I don't expect you to write back. Just, I see it. What he did. What we let him do. I placed it in a box. Not out of bitterness. But because sometimes recognition is enough, and sometimes it's still too late for entry. But not too late for understanding. That matters too. On the first anniversary of the story circle, I gave a short toast. No mic. Just me standing in the space I built. I used to beg for a seat at someone else's table, I said. Now I open the door to this one. No one has to earn it. They just have to arrive. We passed around mugs. Warm bread. Sticky notes filled with truths we'd never spoken aloud. One said, I didn't know my voice wasn't broken until someone stopped trying to fix it. Another, I'm still healing, but now I'm not healing alone. I folded that one. Taped it to the register. Right where I can see it every morning. So no, my father didn't return. Serena never sent another message. Harold's foundation kept hosting galas without me. But somewhere in a different part of the city, A woman stepped into a bookstore and didn't have to explain her silence. And that is legacy. Not inheritance, but impact, not lineage, but invitation. The table I built wasn't carved from oak or tradition. It was made from stories, stitchings of survival, nails of truth. Chairs for those who no longer apologize for their volume. That's where my story ends. Not in rage, not in ruin, but in a room with soft lights. And enough chairs. And a name no longer borrowed from anyone. Tell me, when did you stop knocking on locked doors and start building the room you needed? Because somewhere, someone is waiting for the space you'll make.